la la. Hello everybody. Today's video we're going to be going over Adam Jacoby's Congressional Debate Guide, which is a resource made available to you by the National Speech and Debate Association, NSDA. In 2014, the first version of this guide was published, and then it was refreshed 2017. 2020 or 2021, there was a version of this guide made into a slideshow presentation. So if you're a judge or a coach or a captain looking for a really great way to explain Congress, either to your student or your kiddo or your parents or team, whoever it may be, then that pink presentation is a really great way just to talk through Congress. Very thorough resource. But today we're going to be going over the 2017 guide just because it's my personal favorite. I'll put a link to everything that I talked about down in the description, but without any further ado, let's get into the document. This video is more administrative than anything else. It's not going to tell you how to improve in your debate. We're walking through the guidebooks, and this is really just something that if you've not read through the NSDA guides, you definitely should, especially if you're participating in Congress on the NSDA circuit. If you're doing something like NCFL's Tournament of Champions, different things, I'll talk about those when we get to the different segments, but recognize that there are different rules and that the rule books generally update once a year. The NSDA also does this thing called pilot rules, which usually happen at Adam Jacoby's Harvard tournament, since he is one of the more involved coaches and individuals with Congress in the US, has been for a very long time. He is kind of the person who tests out new things. So when you see a pilot rule of preset recency or 1 hour caps on legislation, generally that's something that Adam Jacoby and the NSDA are implementing, and they'll do pilots or trials at different tournaments and then implement rules for the following season through the NSDA. As a little aside, the National Speech and Debate Association is the largest academic and extracurricular organization related to forensics in the US. So it used to be called the National Forensics League, NFL, and then sold its name to a different organization I am sure you are aware of. They've been around for over 100 years, I believe, or like just creeping up to 100. And they have, I don't want to say a monopoly, but a monopoly on speech and debate tournaments and circuits within the states. It's a really well-run monopoly. They have speech events, debate events, written events. You compete throughout the season on your local circuit, and then if you qualify, go to the national tournament in June. Okay, so getting started on this guide. Congressional debate is a mock legislative assembly competition where students draft bills and resolutions which they and their peers later debate and vote and pass into law and take action, blah, 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 blah. That's the introduction. If you feel like reading it, awesome. The second page is congressional debate terminology. If you are especially new to Congress, I recommend that you take a moment and read through this. It's the very basic glossary. So legislation, bill, resolution, docket, and agenda. There is some stuff to note. Geography isn't really a term that's used anymore. Also, activity, it is referenced, but if you're saying like the activity within the chamber, it's not common to call it that. It's more so people will specify the precedence and recency or the recently entertained motions or whatever activity is happening. They'll be more specific with what they're considering. Also, pertaining to longest standing or standing time, that is sometimes taken into consideration when there's clash involved and if a tournament allows the presiding officer to recognize clash. But generally, longest standing is no longer relevant because now we have preset recency. So it doesn't matter as much how long you've been standing. It's more so just the preset order of recency for speeches. And then a lot of times presiding officers will invert that for the questioning preset recency. This oath of office on the bottom of the second page is something that you, if you are the presiding officer, should have handy for you in case you are asked to swear in a chamber. A lot of times it is the parliamentarian who is asked to administer the oath of office, but that oath of office is the same one or very similar to that which Congress uses. And so in larger tournaments, especially in the final sessions of these tournaments, nationals, TOC, what be it, the parliamentarian or the presiding officer will lead the chamber in the oath of office. All right, next page, competition chronological order. This is just going through the order of how a chamber is going to run. So you're starting with legislation. That's when legislation is written and submitted to the docket for the tournament. The next point is on to researching the docket. So once every piece of legislation has been submitted to the tournament and tournament officials have a chance to weed through them, figure out which ones they want to have on the official docket, they will publish that docket and make it available. Generally, if it's a small tournament, about 10 days before that tournament begins. If it's a larger tournament, and by larger, I mean more than 8 pieces of legislation, you'll have 2-ish weeks. And then if it's one of the largest tournaments, so Tournament of Champions, National Speech and Debate Association's finals in June, then those dockets generally are above 30 pieces of legislation, and students will have more time to research it just because it is a heavier docket. For the role-playing point, it should be mentioned that Congress is that weird middle child between speech and debate. So speech people say it's too debatey to be a speech category. Debate people say it's too speechy to be a debate category, because there is that element of role play. Congressional debaters and legislators are taking on the position as if they were to be in the actual US Congress. So yes, you refer to other representatives. Yes, you refer to your constituents. Yes, you can use rhetoric like speaking across the aisle to those blah, 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 blah on the other side. And it's interesting just seeing how far some individuals will lean into this role-playing aspect, because they'll talk about speaking with their constituents. They'll talk about when I was a kid, although they're 10. They'll lean into it more than others. So just kind of try to get a sense for how far into the role your chamber is leaning, because if you are an individual in middle school, high school talking about going to middle school, high school, and there's someone else in your chamber who is talking about being a representative and showing up every day on Capitol Hill, there's a difference between the perspective that you and guys are assuming and the perspective from which you are speaking. So just be aware of that. Be aware of your positionality. All right. So after you are at the tournament, you have that chamber opening business. That is specifically everything that happens between when the parliamentarian closes the chamber from being entered. So the judges have been seated, the competitors have been seated, the doors are shut, and the parliamentarian stands up in front of the floor and asks for any PO nominations. From that point, the presiding officer is then going to be elected, set the agenda, and that's getting into the chamber opening business. A lot of times there's a blank seating chart for in-person tournaments. Those are becoming less popular after the pandemic, just because a lot of times now presiding officers are using online precedence recency charts. But when I was debating before the pandemic, these seating charts were great and very handy, and you would just draw one as the PO sitting beside the parliamentarian so that you are both aware of where in the room individuals are. And sometimes people would just mark their questions on it, like a tally mark next to people's desks or a diagram or whatever it may be. But that, again, has become less common post-COVID. Next, setting the agenda and presiding officer elections. Whenever I explain Congress, I always put these in the same chunk as the chamber opening business, because in my mind, the time from when the parliamentarian stands to the presiding officer sits down and allows the first person to have the floor for the first affirmative speech, that's the opening business. So all of the time from the last people are entering and leaving the chamber to speeches are actually beginning on the agenda. I would like to say that the guide is backwards for how this commonly goes. So generally, chamber opening business will happen, and part of that is the presiding officer election. And then the presiding officer is the individual who sets the agenda, not the parliamentarian, as this guide suggests. It should be noted that both the agenda and the presiding officer need to have elections, and that those elections need to have a majority of individuals voting for both the PO and the agenda that are going to be used for the session. Generally, if you have multiple sessions in a row with the same chamber, so 3 preliminary sessions, 3 quarterfinals, 2 semifinals, whatever it may be, you set the agenda from the first piece of legislation in the first session all the way through the last one in the last. It's okay to have extra items on the agenda, because you don't need to debate anything that does not open. So say, for example, you have a 7-item agenda and 2 sessions, and each session is about 3 hours. Generally, per session, you would get through about 3 pieces of legislation. But then for that 7th piece of legislation, if you don't open it, so the presiding officer doesn't call for that first affirmative or sponsorship speech, you don't need to close it, meaning that you can just move to, after you've done the motion to move previous question, on the 3rd piece in the 2nd session, so the 6th item on the agenda, you're able to just close the chamber, and you do that by doing a motion to adjourn. If there is a opened piece of legislation that has been tabled from one of the previous sessions, it shouldn't be from session 1, but if the first session PO forgot, that's fine. But regardless, if a piece of legislation has been opened, so you have started debate on it, but you have not yet closed it, meaning that you have not voted on it, then that's when you call for orders of the day. At that time, orders of the day, the PO is going to be the individual to force a count on any opened item, even if there hasn't been a motion to move previous question on it. The way that they do that is by entertaining a motion. So say, for example, that something previously had been tabled, meaning the legislation opened and was closed immediately. Then at the end, presiding officer would entertain a motion to move previous question on the previously tabled piece of legislation, blank, and then name what it was. Competition structure. There are many methods of determining who earns a trophy or gavel at the best legislator speaker or the best presiding officer, blah, 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 blah. What this is saying is that during your competition, the judges are going to be judging you off of different things, but the judges generally are trying to find the best performing individuals within each given chamber. Keep in mind, POs are judged against the rest of the speakers, and recently POs have been ranking quite high, so there's a little bit harsher of a view that a lot of the higher judges are taking on these POs. If you messed up, you might get dropped. So just be aware of that if you're presiding, especially at one of those bigger tournaments. The next page in this guide is talking about understanding civics. Remember that Congress is a mock Congress, so you should be aware of the US government and domestic politics and the way that the federal government works. That's more or less what this piece of paper is saying. Talks a little bit about federalism. Go over it so that you're aware of everything that you should be doing as a congressional debater. This next page is on research sources. When we have conversations surrounding media biases and research sources, this is what we're talking about. So if you have individuals who are consistently citing sources that are irreputable or they don't have a good reputation, it kind of drags down the credibility of their side's arguments and the ethos of their ability to appeal rhetorically to the audience. So having a strong research background using these policy institutions, think tanks, government agencies, or well-regarded media sources is super important. So if you're ever looking for additional resources, this is a really, really great place to start your research on any given piece of legislation. Especially from these, I would like to recommend those think tanks just because they really do explain things well. Personal favorites: Pew Research Center, Brookings Institute, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I always am interested to see what they say. Cato Institute, certainly interesting. Council on Foreign Relations. Human Rights Watch, I also give a lot of attention to. The next page is talking about writing legislation. So remember that there are 3 different types of legislation: bills, resolutions, and constitutional amendments. Bills and resolutions both need a majority in order to pass, so half plus 1. And then constitutional amendments need 2/3 majority since they are not just simple laws. Remember that bills and resolutions are different. A bill will enact or alter an existing law, or they will create a law that does not yet exist. Resolutions instead are a change or a proposed change to the paradigm of Congress. So instead of a law going into action, they are a suggestion for Congress to do. Constitutional amendments are just how they sound. They amend the Constitution. You are able to author legislation whenever you want. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that if you are a coach or a captain, you have your kids do this, just because it's helpful to see how legislation comes together in order to know how to pull it apart. So first, bills are divided into sections. Resolutions are divided into whereas clauses. I have a video going over legislation, so I'm not going to go too in depth here. But do be aware that there are templates available from the NSDA and that those are a really great guide for you. I actually I really do recommend using those templates, especially if the other option is just blindly trying to write up a bill or resolution. It's great. All right, this next section is on speaking. Again, I have made a video on speaking, but this is just going over a little bit more details. So remember, authorship, sponsorship, those first cycle affirmatives, and then you have your first negative, and then you alter neg af, neg af, neg af all the way through. When you are tracking cycles, I'm going to draw a little diagram right here of what I personally do. Whenever I would preside, I would have a Post-it note beside me that was a different color from the rest of the paper that I was using, just because I needed it to stand out really, really quickly. And I would always have 2 empty bubbles, as if it's like a multiple choice bubble sheet, all the way down the paper. I would draw the bubble before I would call for the speech, and then once the speech had been assigned to a speaking member on the floor, I would fill it in just with a pen. So I would do that first on the af and then on the negation. So draw the bubble during that af speech just to know next time calling for an egg. If the cycle was full, then both circles would be filled in and I would draw a line between them. If there was a broken cycle, so a speech had been called for and given, and then a speech had been called for but no one stood and you were forced to break cycle onto the next speech of the same side as the previous, then I would draw the circle but I would leave it open. And at that time, for the next cycle, when I'm calling on the next negation, I would still draw it on the same cycle as the previous affirmation, but it would be very clear to me that the speech on the cycle above didn't have anyone giving it. And instead of calling for, say, the third negation speech, because we just had our third affirmation speech, I would call for the second negation on the third cycle. The reason that matters is because your judges are in the back of the room scribbling frantically, trying to follow every single speech, listen to every single question, be aware of the legislation, try and pick up on all of the refutation, everything that's happening within the chamber. And if you, the presiding officer, confuse the chamber as to how many speeches have been given or which cycle of debate you are on, it's very difficult for the judges and for the speakers to be aware of what's going on in the round. So just keep that in mind when you are calling. Be very, very clear. Second negation on the third cycle, or whatever it may be. Okay, back to the guide. Speeches should be delivered extemporaneously, which means spoken spontaneously based on an outline of notes rather than recited word for word from a manuscript. That also changed during COVID. So because we were all on our computers, it became so much easier just to have a script word for word of what you're going to say. Now, the terrible, horrible, no good, really bad thing that judges are seeing is that students don't know how to speak extemporaneously, and they bring up their computers with them while they are speaking, and they're holding it all awkwardly, trying not to drop their $1,000 computer and not able to gesture because they don't have a hand free, and it's terrible. And please don't do this. Print out your page, write it down on a legal pad. Even if you had a smaller device, it would be better. I still am against using devices in any capacity, because what happens if you accidentally close the page or it's not loading or whatever? You should be able to speak from an outline. Anyways, people aren't speaking extemporaneously as often, and it really makes it difficult as a judge to distinguish one speaker from the next, which, that's the point for speakers. But if you are a good extemporaneous speaker, giving a crystallization, giving a well thought out refutation, being able to speak eloquently despite not having yourself written out word for word, good job. I will rank you high if I ever judge you, and other judges with the same frustration will as well. Something to note, you should be flowing during other speeches. What that means is each contention that comes up, you should be writing down the main argument and then the impact of it. If there's a specific source or reference or link that you want to note, be sure to do that. And just keep track of speeches and contentions on the affirmation and negation, which ones link together, especially if you're going to be giving a crystallization speech, just so that you have some stuff to talk from. Effective speakers use clear transitions and signpost ideas. That is when you are meta and talk through your speech as you're speaking it. So first, moving on to my first point. Second, moving on to my next point. And finally, even if you didn't buy any of the arguments that I presented to you so far, my third contention will convince you to negate. Blah, 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 blah. It should be noted that speech organization is pretty much the same for every single speech. You got that introduction, 15 to 30 seconds, body, about 2 minutes, conclusion, about 30 seconds. I disagree with this. I think that the conclusion should be much shorter, but Adam Jacoby does appreciate when someone has good presentation, and technically you should be leaning a little bit more into the effective word economy. I've heard someone say before, just making the most out of every word within the 2 minutes of your body, and then for that conclusion, really wrapping up the themes, coming back to your AGD, your attention getting device at the beginning, and having it be a well-wrapped fluid speech. That's great if you can do it. But usually I would be speaking until about 2:55, realize I need to conclude, have a sentence or two, and then like one sentence linking back to the AGD, finish around 3:07. Okay. What's next? Questions. Questions help clarify confusing points in debate and show a genuine interest in what other speakers are saying. They should. Sometimes you have softball questions that are just, could you please summarize your second point for me? And there's nothing wrong with those questions, but there's nothing right with them, you know? Like, they're not adding much to the debate other than showing that maybe you weren't listening as closely as possible. If you're the speaker, just summarize it in a couple words. So what was your claim? What was your impact? And then let them ask a follow-up question if they had one or choose to, or let the last 10 seconds just be really awkward and show the judges that as well. Okay, so now we are on to page 8 on the direct questioning guidelines. Remember that direct questioning and indirect questioning are very different, and that the evaluation of questioners does matter. You look at the coherence and relevance of questioning line, quality of follow-ups, quality of argumentation, and then for the evaluation of the PO, really it's just time guidelines and then calling on questioners fairly. Again, a whole video on questions, go watch it if you want it. The procedure for debate, this is mainly for the PO. If you're going to preside, read page 9. So time is of the essence, blah, 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 blah. Remember, you're trying to be efficient. Setting the agenda is important at the beginning of the sessions. If you need to lay items on the table, that means that you open debate on them, but you don't close them. So if there's been a motion to lay something on the table, you don't immediately force a vote. It's more like you put a pin in it and you just leave it alone for a little bit. And then at the end of that session, you either need to call orders of the day and force a vote on it, or pull it from the table and continue debate on it when you run out of other legislative items. Legislators stand if they wish to be recognized to move, speak, or vote on a main motion. It is good practice to stand and do either a name count or a number count during main motions. So the most important motions within a chamber generally should have a little bit more formality to them than, say, like a motion for a recess or something a little bit smaller. Also, along that same line, if you physically cannot speak, or if you're on an online chamber, accommodations are going to need to be considered by that PO. So make sure that if you're presiding, you are considering every individual person within your chamber. Only the presiding officer recognizes legislators who wish to question the speaker. It's not the parliamentarian or anyone else. Clash generally isn't taken into consideration, but it depends, again, on the tournaments and tournament rules. Do not yield remaining speaking time to another legislator. What that means is if there is a block of 30 seconds and someone only uses 5 seconds of it because they asked a really quick question, got a really quick answer, those remaining 25 seconds are not yielded to another speaker. They are absorbed by the chair. So if you're presiding over something like that, then you would say, thank you, remaining 25 seconds absorbed by the chair. Next speaker, Representative Smith, or whoever it may be. We're being respectful of others. Amendments are super fun. We're going to have a whole video on those, but if you are interested in the procedure, you can read them here. Gavel signals, next big thing. So it should be noted that gavel signals technically do not time the amount of time that has elapsed. They time the amount of time remaining. Why this matters is because if you have a 4-minute speech or a final appeal or some type of weird and wacky time something happening at your tournament, it's always 1 minute remaining, 30 seconds remaining, and then once the time has elapsed. Generally, presiding officers will give that final 3 gavel tap, time has elapsed at 2:55 or started at 2:55, just to be like a very clear 3 taps at that point. And then they stand at 3 minutes to indicate to the person standing in front of them on the floor that they have 10 seconds. And then they'll gavel them down either with a pen or the back of a gavel, just to show like your time is up, you need to keep going, finish up your speech. But be aware of specific timing procedures for the tournaments that you're attending. whether you're the presiding officer or not. But if you are the PO, make sure that you go over your timing procedure in that housekeeping speech after you have been elected. Helpful phrases. So for those members of the chamber, if you want to make a motion, you say, I move that, or I move to. If you want to leave the room, so say, for example, that you need to use the bathroom or something happens, you need to leave, then the legislator will stand. I rise to a point of personal privilege. Chair says, state that privilege. Legislator says to leave the room. Making amendments, that's the amendment form above. So move to amend. Remember that there are a couple steps before that. You can't move to amend before an amendment has been submitted to the chair. So just read amendment procedure carefully. Close debate on the current issue, move to the previous question, ask about an error. That's a motion. I rise to a point of parliamentary inquiry or order. Sometimes say move to a point of information, POI. That language is taken partially from Robert's Rules, also partially from BP, British Parliament, but generally point of parliamentary inquiry. And then the chair will say state that. Legislator kind of describes what's going on. If you want to second a motion, which means that you are in favor of the motion passing, then you say second. If you want to table something, we already went through tabling. I move to lay the question on the table. Remember, the question is the piece of legislation. And then to take something from the table, I move to take from the table the legislative item blank, and then list the title. All right, next chunk of this guide is going through tracking speaking order. So two main ways to track speaking order. Both of these are very, very clear, and you could do them either on a Google Sheet or on an Excel sheet or written in front of you. What I always did was have a piece of paper in front of me that was like this little baby legal pad, and I would write names in columns and then scribble them out as I went. And then each additional speech that an individual has given, I would write a column to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right, and then just the recency would be the order in which they were written. So each time someone moved over, I would put their name up to the top. So those are some good examples. Look at those. Ethics and evidence. Ethics is kind of a big thing in Congress. A lot of times you could be making up fake information. You could be coming up with some study that never happened. You could be citing something or misrepresenting something. And a lot of times, because topics move so quickly through Congress and there are just so many moving pieces in a round of Congress, you could get away with making fake evidence. But first, not worth it. If someone does an evidence challenge, you are pretty much dropped from that round, and it's very difficult to recover from that and advance through a tournament. Second, it's not ethical to make up fake information. Plus, Wi-Fi has kind of become commonplace in rounds, so if you're trying to make some fake source, there's a really good chance that the person in front of you is Googling it. If there is ever anything that you feel is outside of Congress ethics, talk to the parliamentarian or to tournament staff, tab staff. This page is really just going over everything relevant to POs. So if you are super, super interested in presiding, read page 12. Page 13 is a table of parliamentary motions. Again, this is for POs, but also for people in the chamber who want to remain particularly, I don't want to say like invested, because everyone should be invested in the chamber, but if you're looking to make stuff happen, if you're looking to create activity in the chamber, look at us using our glossary. Okay, so if you're looking to make activity in the chamber, then this table of parliamentary motions will be helpful for you. The next page is the congressional debate speaking rubric. So this is for judges and parliamentarians to judge each individual speaker. Right after that is the presiding rubric. So again, judges, go ahead and pay attention to that. The recency table and fractions of voting is for POs. So if you are looking to preside and don't have a recency table set up for yourself yet, then you can always take this one and just do the different ways that you were shown how to preside up on page 10. Yeah, page 10. So that's Adam Jacoby's guide. It is important to note that the NSDA has a unified manual of events that they form every year. So rules, forms, and manuals under that page on the NSDA's website, I will put a link. They have each year's unified manual. We do have a 2023 manual that exists. It looks like the most recent one that I see right now is 2022, but I remember seeing... Oh, no, this is updated. Updated February 24th, 2023. It has the wrong name on the intro page, but looks like it was updated fairly recently. So whenever there are pilot rules for a tournament, stuff happening outside of the norm from season to season, generally the NSDA is going to do little trials at national circuit debates. So whether that is Harvard or National Tournament of Champions or whatever or wherever that may be, they sometimes pilot rules. Examples of pilots are like preset recency or 1 hour caps on legislation or different things such as those. And whenever you have a tournament piloting something, it's important for everyone within the chamber to be aware of what's happening, just so that they know what's different between this chamber and the rest of the sessions that they were a part of. Oh, we also need to talk about the templates for writing legislation. So speechanddebate.org/legislation-templates/, you're going to find templates for writing legislation from the NSDA in a variety of formats, Word, Google, and Pages. I always, whenever I start off with kiddos in my debate program, will have them write legislation just to see, okay, what have you been exposed to so far? What is your current skill level and how can we move from here? So I will have them write a piece of legislation, write me an authorship on it, write a first negative on it, and then our first practice really is just going through their legislation, their speeches, doing some refutation, rebuttal, questioning, all that kind of stuff. But all this is... All this is to say that these templates are super helpful. So if you are a new debater or a coach, captain, judge, whatever it may be, go ahead and consider doing something like a legislation writing drill with your team just to see where they are and whether or not they can have some legislation that could be submitted. All right, that is everything that I wanted to talk about. We went through the NSDA guide as well as the Unified Manual, Congressional Debate Legislation Templates, and that's what the NSDA has to offer you. So keep in mind, read tournament rules before, but if you have any questions, let me know. Go ahead and read through those guides. They are super, super helpful. Anyways, that is this video. Have a wonderful day. Hope that you're all doing well. Bye!